So, material objects, or the question of things. We'll be looking at the question of things and also the question of stuff. This is the kind of topic that probably gives philosophers a bad name, that we go into all of this great detail about everyday objects. But it's kind of the most ancient form of philosophy. If you ever read the pre-Socratics, the philosophers that predated Socrates, these are the kind of issues that they obsessed over. A friend of mine once joked about the pre-Socratics that you have arguments between them like, the world is an egg bagel. No, it isn't. It's a bran muffin, you know, because they're having these seemingly very meta-level disputes. But what goes around comes around, and, 21st century metaphysicians are interested in the same questions. So, the topic we'll be focusing on most is the special composition question, which was popularized, although he himself says that he didn't come up with this question, by a philosopher called Peter van Inwagen, who is one of the most influential living metaphysicians, in a book called Material Beings. And essentially, it's the question of, when do some things make another thing? How is it that things can compose another thing? As, for example, we are composed of our cells, or a car is composed of its parts. What is the criterion or criteria, plural, that a set of things must jointly meet so that those things are themselves, but together they are also a new thing, a new object? Because in everyday speech, we would never deny that I am an object, a physical object, or a car is a physical object. So it itself is a thing. But of course, it is a thing that is made of other things. What is it that has to be true of those other things to make it that jointly they make a car? Or what is it that's true of my cells that jointly they make me? And as usual with philosophy, this is the kind of question that, most people don't even consider. It just, they just do. But of course, as with philosophy always, the more you press at the question, the more that you find that there are problems with every single answer. So, in Van Inwagen's terms, there are moderate answers and there are extreme answers. And the extreme answers divide into universalism. Universalism is the idea that any set of things you could imagine make another thing. So, the tip of my nose, the Eiffel Tower, and a whale somewhere in the Atlantic jointly compose an object. It's not an object that we care about. It's not an object we've got a name for. But it is an actual object that is itself a thing just as much as I am a thing or a car is a thing. It's a thing that is composed of those other things, tip of my nose, Eiffel Tower, the whale. Those things together comprise this thing. And that is true for any things that you can list. For example, there's another thing that is just the tip of my nose and the Eiffel Tower. So that is called universalism. So there is just pretty much an unlimited number of things of just the same ontological meaning to do with existence, ontological level of me. I am a thing, the object I've just described, made of the tip of my nose and the Eiffel Tower, etc., is a thing just in the same way. That's universalism. Nihilism says that composition never happens. The answer is never. So universalism, the answer is always. When do some objects compose another thing? Always. Nihilism is the answer never. So the only objects there are the basic building blocks that are called simples, whatever those are. And we'll look at that idea in a second. So nihilism is the idea of you just have the objects you start with. Composition never happens. So now both of those ideas seem kind of crazy because it just seems true that composition in favor of universalism, it just seems true that composition happens, that the wheels and the hood and the doors and everything else of my car together make a single thing, my car. So composition does seem to happen. Okay, so that seems to rule out nihilism. But it doesn't seem to always happen. It seems to not happen in some cases, like in the case of the tip of my nose and the Eiffel Tower and the whale. That just doesn't seem right, that that's an object. It's certainly not an object. It's not a real object. It's like an imaginary object, whereas I am a real object. My car is a real object. So it seems like intuitively, we think that the answer must not be one of the extreme ones. It must be, so the answer to this must be sometimes. That's the moderate answer. Universalism says always, nihilism says never. These positions say sometimes under a set number of conditions. But then, what are the conditions? Van Inwagen goes through the most obvious ones to start off with, which are, he calls them contact, or what they're simply bonding. So locking together is another idea. Simply contacting is one. Locking together is another. So in other words, this is kind of like, if you think of Lego. So you have a big pile of Lego, and when it's just loose, you just have the bricks. You don't have any further object. Whereas if you stick the Lego bricks together, then you got another object. You've got the Lego bricks plus the thing that you've just made of the Lego. So that sort of Lego view seems to suggest that bonding is the right suggestion. That, my cells make me because they're bonded together in some way. My cells are bonded together so that I hold together, but they're not bonded with anything I touch. Okay, but it turns out that you don't get the restrictions, the right restrictions. So restricted composition says composition happens sometimes, but not always. But we want the restriction to cover the things we intuitively believe in, ships and seals, and ships and shoes and sealing wax and cabbages and kings. We want those to meet the standard, but not weird objects like the tip of my nose and the Eiffel Tower. But the trouble is, whatever candidate you come up with doesn't restrict it to the right ones. Either it doesn't restrict it enough or it restricts it too much. So for example, if you have locking as one of your suggestions, simple contact would mean that every time you shake hands with somebody, a new object is formed because your hands are touching. And that just seems wrong. That seems too liberal in our ontology of objects. But unfortunately, if you try and improve it by suggesting locking, so that you're not locked together if you just touch hands, and even if you shake hands, it's not locked together because you can easily pull them apart, unless you're shaking hands with Trump. But what if you suddenly paralyzed when you were shaking hands with somebody so that it was impossible to pull you apart? We still wouldn't want to say that you had formed a new object. So there are just problems with those. Now, Van Inwagen's own position is actually very close to nihilism except he wants to say that the only composite objects that exist are organisms, hence the name it's been given, Organicism. Now this view is the relative of a view in the topic personal identity, which we will come to later, called animalism. And in fact, animalism is very much inspired by Organicism. One of the major pushers of animalism, Erik Olson, is openly influenced by van Inwagen. So here the idea is that a composite object exists when the components of it together form a living thing, form a life. So there are just simples, whatever the basic building blocks are, and the only composite objects are organisms. This can include plants, obviously, anything living. So what makes my cells part of me is that together they comprise a single life. Now, this is obviously each of the cells has its own life. It is alive. If you took all the cells apart, they would be alive. But that's not what the life is. The life is the composition of them. Together they comprise a living thing that is me. Or, you know, the cells of a tree comprise a living thing that is a tree. Now, it can be comprised of the same cells, but be dead, in which case you just have the cells. You don't have the tree anymore if it's dead, according to this view. Now, the very idea of a life is kind of questionable, and obviously a lot of questions need to be asked about it. But that's still a weird view. I mean, because it's still awfully close to nihilism because it denies any inanimate objects. Like, for example, cars don't exist. There are no cars. There are just car parts. Some of them driving around and some of them scattered on front lawns in Appalachia. But there are no cars. So again, that view seems too close to nihilism for most people. Now, the series style say that, well, the problem with the other candidates is you're never going to get a standard of composition. You're never going to get criteria of composition that are the same across all kinds of objects, because what it is to compose a car is different from what it is to compose a tree. So series style suggests that the answer to this question should be relativized to the type of thing it is. So you have to have a different answer to this question for each type of thing. Here are the criteria for composing a tree. Here are the different criteria for composing a car, and so on. The trouble with those is then you've got the question of, well, how do we settle the types of things? I mean, who settles the categories of objects? How many categories of objects? This is the kind of thing that, for example, Aristotle was interested in his work, categories. But you know, that's a whole can of worms that's being opened up there. And also there seems to be this problem of transitivity of parthood. So for example, if two different things, if one thing is composed by a bunch of other things, so for example, I don't know, a computer is composed of circuit boards or something. What if the criteria of composition for the circuit boards are different from the criteria of composition of the computer? Then you could say the chips are part of the circuit board, but they're not part of the computer because while they meet the criteria for composing the circuit board, there are different criteria for meeting the computer. Now, obviously, that's with that example, it's unlikely to be true that they're different because, you know, circuit boards are very similar to computers. In fact, you can fit a computer on a single circuit board, or in a single chip. But that's the idea, that you're going to run up against that where some smaller things are part of something, and then that thing is part of another thing, but then the smaller things are not part of the larger thing because they don't meet the different criteria. If there are different criteria of parthood, you're not going to get transitivity. Transitivity is, like if A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then A is greater than C. It carries through. It wouldn't work. Whereas we think that parthood should be a transitive relationship. If one small thing is a part of a medium-sized thing and the medium-sized thing is part of a big thing, then the small thing should be part of the big thing. But that wouldn't necessarily work if we had a series star. Then we have this position, brutal composition. In metaphysics, you tend to run across, somebody is always going to defend a brutal view, which David Lewis would basically say is giving up. Because why is it called brutal? Well, because of the term brute fact. What is a brute fact? A brute fact is just a fact that you have to accept and cannot explain. It's when a toddler is asking you questions, why, and you answer the question, and they ask of your answer to that question. They say, yeah, but why? And then you answer that question, and then they say, yeah, but why? And you reach a point at which you say, just because. We have reached rock bottom. Well, then you are saying that the last one in the line is a brute fact that doesn't require explanation. And you're always going to have some brute facts, but you want them to be as minimal as possible. And to say that it's just a brute fact that some things compose other things. So when do some objects compose another object? The brutal composition answer is, I'm not going to explain, they just do. I'm not going to give you criteria of composition. They just do. That seems like giving up. And even if you can, so for example, Marcosian defended this view. And Marcosian says, well, but that seems intuitive, right? So people say, yeah, you're right, they just do. And, we know that they do, even though we can't give a reason why they do. So let's just say they just do. Cells make up me, they just do. The parts of my car make up the car, they just do. Not because of bonding, not for any reason, they just do. And he says, doesn't that appeal? And Van Cleve says, well, but another deeply held intuition is that there has to be a reason why they do, particularly given that they do in some cases and they don't in other cases. So it seems like there must be a system behind this. It's not that, we just have magic composition recognizers that we know, oh, this is a case, wait a minute, I'm getting a special tingle. This is a case where composition happens. Oh, I'm not feeling it over here, so this is a case where composition doesn't happen. That's just giving up. So the brutal position is a sign where, you're just getting angry and you're just pounding the table. It's a brute fact. That's giving up. All right. Now, apart from brutal composition, the other answers face what are called Sorites problems. Which is, again, a pre-Socratic issue. This is the paradox of the heap. And the paradox of the heap is it's impossible to give criteria for what is a heap. Because if you try to give, imagine you start with a heap of rice and you remove 1 grain of rice. Okay, 1 grain of rice, we would agree, is not enough to make the difference between a heap existing and not a heap existing. But if you keep on doing this, so, presumably we would therefore, applying that principle, we would say, if you remove 1 grain of rice from a heap, you've still got a heap. But of course, if you keep doing it to infinity, you have 1 grain of rice left. and then no grains of rice, and you obviously don't have a heap. So it seems like it's impossible to give a criterion of heaphood, because if you say it's exactly 9,025 grains of rice, then that violates the principle that you can always remove one grain of rice from a heap and still have a heap. So you've got to give up one of those. You've got to either give up the idea that you know, a grain of rice doesn't make a difference, and that seems pretty intuitive, that a grain of rice doesn't make a difference between a heap existing and not existing. Or if a grain of rice does, then you could say, okay, what if I took away an atom? Clearly that doesn't, but of course if you keep taking away atoms, you're still going to remove the heap. So it's the idea that it's pretty much impossible to draw a line, whereas, so the extreme answers are ways to avoid this. The extreme answers say, well, there is no line, so we don't have that problem. All right. Now, why would you believe in universalism? The idea that there exist basically an infinity of objects, most of which are incredibly weird, and can include parts from this side of the universe and the other side of the universe. So nobody would ever encounter all of the object. Why would you believe that? Other than light brutal composition, it's a way out of the awkwardness of this question. Well, one argument that is given for this view is by David Lewis. David Lewis is a defender of this view. David Lewis, who recurs throughout this course because he's got interesting, usually strange, but incredibly well defended views on basically every topic in metaphysics. He argues that vagueness cannot be a feature of the world. The world is not itself vague. What is vague is our description of the world. So our concepts can be vague such that, for example, a classic example is bald. We can't tell what's the dividing line between someone being bald and balding and not bald. It's, you know, you can't give it a number in precise numbers of hairs. So vagueness is a feature of our concepts, but the world itself is not vague. The world is determinate. Whereas any of these answers, he says, imply ontological vagueness. Because we can't draw a strict line, it implies that it's vague when something composes something else. It actually is vague out there, and vagueness is out there in the world. Because that seems wrong, we want an answer that is not vague, and universalism meets that. The other one is what Cornell, in the piece that I had you read, calls the argument from elimination. He says, basically, it works like this. Composition sometimes happens. Restricted answers don't work. So we can't have any of the moderate answers for the reasons that we've seen, like Sorites and vagueness. So restricted answers to this question don't work. So we've either got to pick between universalism and nihilism, but composition sometimes happens, so nihilism must be wrong. So by a process of elimination, universalism's your guy. That's the view that you're left with. All right. Now, the main argument against universalism is, as David Lewis says, remember David Lewis is the guy who is a modal realist. He believes in the existence of possible worlds. So, you know, if you're going to believe that, what's the problem in believing in an infinity of physical objects? It's just one more thing that people look at you funny for. As he says about his view of modal realism, the main argument against it is an incredulous stare. And he says, and I don't know how to respond to an incredulous stare. That's not an argument. But that's the main response to universalism is, you're shitting me, right? That's a crazy view. You mean that there's all this infinite number of objects? Now, if you go beyond that, what are more substantive arguments? A classic one is parsimony. Parsimony is the idea that you should keep your ontology, your list of things that exists, minimal. The classic parsimony, ontological parsimony principle is Occam's razor. So Occam's razor says, look, suppose we have two theories that explain the same phenomena. One of them posits invisible pixies, and one of them doesn't. But both of them explain the phenomena. Which one should we believe? Well, because the pixies are invisible, we can't see them. We can't. So our only reason for believing in the pixies is because believing them helps explain the phenomena we want explaining. But if we've got this alternative view that does it without the pixies, we should believe that one. Why should we believe it? Because it's simpler. Okay, that's a principle of ontological parsimony. And that principle is being applied to universalism. Now, Lewis's response to this, and it's the same response he gives to a similar argument against his modal realism, is there's two kinds of parsimony, and only one of them is important. There's quantitative parsimony, that is, you should keep your total number of objects lower. And he says, I don't see the appeal of that. What's wrong with a big number of things? The universe is potentially infinite. The one that matters is qualitative parsimony. So, for example, in the example I gave you, one theory doesn't say there are invisible pixies, and the other one does. Now, even if the one that doesn't involve invisible pixies requires a much larger number of things we already believe in, that doesn't seem to be a problem. So this could be quantitatively not so parsimonious as the invisible pixies view, but it's still better because it's qualitatively parsimonious. There's a kind of thing it doesn't have to add, which is the invisible pixies. And he says universalism isn't adding any new kinds of stuff because we already believe in objects. And I'm just saying there's a lot more objects than you thought. So there's nothing wrong with that. More powerful is the identity argument. And this is given by van Inwagen. And it's a similar argument. A related argument is used by, as I said, Olson in arguing for his view, animalism. So the example is on page 24 of the Cornell. He says, consider an ordinary composite object, call this tree a tree, and we'll call this tree spruce. According to universalism, spruce is a composite object and is composed of a large number of simples. Let's call the fusion of those simples F. So let's say the tree is made up of a bunch of cells. The tree is called spruce, but we can also refer to all of those cells, according to universalism, comprise an object F. Now, obviously, F is one and the same as spruce, so F equals spruce. But suppose a bolt of lightning strikes spruce. Spruce is destroyed, right? You can destroy trees. Trees are objects that can be destroyed. And spruce gets destroyed. So spruce doesn't exist anymore. But according to universalism, F, which is composed of all the cells that made up spruce still exists. Because we haven't destroyed... okay, let's talk of the atoms instead of the cells. So all of the atoms that make up spruce. A lightning strike will not destroy the atoms. The atoms are just scattered. But universalism allows scattered objects, like the tip of my nose, the Eiffel Tower, and the whale, or, you know. It doesn't say that because it doesn't say bonding or any of those. It doesn't say that to compose an object you have to be near one another or touching one another. No, you can compose an object, you know, wherever you are. So the scattered atoms that are F still exists. So notice spruce no longer exists, but F exists. But wait a minute. We thought F equals spruce. But if F equals spruce, then everything that happens to spruce must happen to F. But that's not true, because F still exists and spruce doesn't. So clearly F no longer equals spruce. But how do we explain the different persistence conditions for these objects? How can you be literally one and the same object? F and spruce are one and the same object, according to universalism. And yet, one of them survives and the other one doesn't. Now, that's supposed to be a challenge to universalism. However, universalists have said, challenge accepted. Or actually, you don't even have to be a universalist to respond to this. But two responses to this challenge that are open to the universalist are to say, well, first of all, I deny your claim of identity. Sure, spruce and F are co-located and made of exactly the same atoms, but that doesn't mean that they are one and the same object. What is happening is that F is constituting spruce. But constitution can cease to occur without the same problems of identity. So before the lightning strike, F constitutes spruce, and after the lightning strike, F still exists but does not constitute spruce. Now this is similar to the famous case of the statue and the clay. Suppose you have a lump of clay, you form it into a statue. Now the statue and the clay are basically made of the same stuff. They have exactly the same atoms in exactly the same arrangement. The lump of clay hasn't vanished, it's still there. So you haven't destroyed the lump of clay by turning it into a statue, it's still there, it's just the statue. Now, but then what happens if you destroy the statue? You get exactly the same puzzle as with spruce and F. How is it that they can be one and the same but have different persistence conditions? One suggestion is that the lump of clay constitutes but is not identical with the statue. So there's a question of constitution that's different from the question of composition. This is composition. Composition is when you have a bunch of stuff. When does the group of things together compose a new larger object? Whereas constitution is just one object constituting another object. So there's a one-to-one relationship, whereas here it's sort of many-to-one. Now constitution has its own puzzles, and as we'll see when we get to personal identity, because that does seem to be a handy answer if you want to say that, for example, I exist, but then I cease to exist when I die, but all the atoms that make me up. So I want to say two things about me. I am composed of atoms. Here I am, this is me. I don't believe in immaterial mind or anything like that. I'm a material object, a very complicated one, but I am entirely composed of atoms. I cease to exist when I die, but the atoms are all still here. So it's exactly like spruce and F, that what's left over is no longer me, it's my corpse, let's say. Well, but how can I no longer be there if all the stuff that composed me is still there? What's happened to me? Well, why aren't I still there if all the stuff that made me is still there? And one answer is that the atoms constituted me, and now they no longer do. Lewis's answer is four-dimensionalism. That is, he says, here's the answer. And you can have two things overlap without them being the same thing. In Flint, for example, there is a stretch where the I-75 and the 23 are one and the same, right? You're on both of them when you're driving along a single stretch of highway. It's not two highways somehow stacked on top of each other. You're on a single stretch of highway, but are you on the I-75? Yes. Are you on the 23? Yes. How is that possible if they're two different roads? Well, because they just overlap in one stretch. But the I-75 does not, is obviously a separate thing. So it's okay for two things to overlap. The problem with spruce and F is that they seem to, the entirety of spruce seems to be the entirety of F at one moment. Whereas if you're a four-dimensionalist, you say, wait a minute, we're not seeing all of spruce and F at any one moment. We're just seeing a time slice of them. But all of spruce is the entire history of spruce, because it's not just a three-dimensional object, it's a four-dimensional object. So for example, this is not me, all of me, this is just a snapshot of me at this particular moment. All of me goes from my birth or conception, whichever you decide is the starting point, to my death or my or rotting, depending on whether you believe that I am my corpse. But an entire length of time, let's say 90 years, that's me. Now, and so spruce lived for a certain amount of time, and F only overlapped with spruce a very short time, because of course, spruce being a living thing, it would have shed atoms constantly. So F is only overlaps with spruce for a very short time, and therefore it's perfectly okay to say that F and spruce are not the same, even though they overlapped at one point. They share a part, just like conjoined twins. They're two different individuals, but they share organs, let's say. Whose organ is that? It's both of theirs, but they are two different individuals. Now, four-dimensionalism, we're going to discuss in more detail later, but that's a response to that. Okay, so universalism has some answers, but it's still a weird view. What about nihilism? Nihilism, of course, says there are no objects. Now, well, then why do we think of a car? What are we doing when we're talking about cars? We're talking about things that don't really exist. So how can we talk about cars? What's happening when we talk about cars? What's going on? And a nihilist has to come up with an explanation of what's going on when we think we're talking about cars. And what it is, you come up with a kind of paraphrasing strategy. So when we talk about cars, we're talking about a bunch of objects arranged car-wise. Now, but really, the only things that exist are the simples that comprise the cars. Now, arguments against nihilism, presumably, I still haven't given the arguments for. Why might you believe this? Okay, the causal overdetermination argument. That is, suppose a baseball smashes a window. The nihilist would say the explanation for that is that the atoms that we say compose the baseball collided with the atoms of the window, And the nihilist can describe exactly what's happened and explain why the window broke. It's in terms of collisions of atoms. What does the baseball add to that? The answer is it adds nothing. Is there anything that the baseball does over and above the atoms that comprise it? If we had no concept of baseballs, would the window still have broken? And the answer is yes, it would have. And so the baseball just doesn't add anything to the answer. So there's a good quote about what would happen if all of the plates in my cupboard disappeared. The answer is I wouldn't care. Here we go. If all the plates in my kitchen dresser were to cease to exist, but all the molecules in my dresser were to stay arranged exactly as they are, I wouldn't care very much. My guests would have no new reason to worry about their food getting all over the tablecloth. In fact, they would never know unless I told them, but come to think of it, I would never know either. So the nihilist is basically saying these objects don't add anything over and above what they're composed of. If you get rid of the objects, nobody would notice because all of the atoms are still there arranged in the same way. So basically, the way to think of nihilism is just to say that objects aren't really there. They're just imposed by us as handy ways that help us think about the world. But they're not real. And if you say that, you're being ideologically parsimonious. This is a bit like ontological parsimony says that you are restricting what you say exists. So nihilism is ontologically parsimonious, but it's also ideologically parsimonious. It restricts the concepts that you use. And it solves, and the best reason to believe in nihilism is it gets you out of the problem that all of these other views have in answering the special composition question. It doesn't have the problem of constitution. You don't have to talk about four-dimensionalism. Now, against it, you have this idea of emergence. Let me give an analogy here. Actually, the analogy is with philosophy of mind. Most philosophers of mind, the vast majority, believe that minds are composed of material objects. That is, most contemporary philosophers of minds are not like Descartes. Descartes believed that my brain is not my mind. My mind is a separate kind of immaterial stuff. Most philosophers now say, no, if you destroyed my brain, you would destroy my mind. They're not separate kinds of things. But mental properties are in some way emergent from physical properties. That is, David Chalmers has made basically a career out of this, that you cannot capture mental properties by just talking in physical terms. So the language with which we use to describe physical objects of location, charge, whatever, all of the language of physics, cannot capture consciousness, cannot capture what it's like to experience, our mental experience. So that is irreducible to material properties. Whereas nihilism is a reductive view. It says that physical objects don't really exist. All that exists is the stuff they're made of. Another analogy is in social science. There's a position called methodological individualism, and it says you shouldn't really talk about classes or nations or any of these group terms. You should just talk about individuals. individuals are what make up classes. And opposed to that, people like Marxists, for example, say, no, you can talk about the properties of classes that do not reduce to the individuals, because individuals don't even know they're in a class. So individuals cannot comprise a class by their actions. Classes have laws that apply to them that are irreducible to facts about individuals. That's what's going on here. So nihilism can't capture all that it needs to capture. Even if it's true that all there is ontologically, there's no more ontologically to a plate than the atoms that make it up. You can't say everything you need to say. Now, against this is David Lewis, the Universalist, says, what if, though, there are no simples? So nihilism is the view that there are things that exist, but they're just the most simple, basic building blocks of the world. What Democritus called atoms, or Leucippus, his mysterious teacher. Atoms meaning in Greek uncuttable. They're the basic building blocks of the world, because you can't get any smaller than that. These things, simples. What if, says David Lewis, there are no simples, that the universe is atomless gunk. It's just, you never reach bottom. For any tiny piece of matter, you can divide it further. So, and you can keep going to infinity. So Democritus was wrong. But there were, I can't remember, there were pre-Socratics who thought that you could keep dividing and dividing and you would never reach bottom. If that's the case, if there were such a thing as gunk, then nihilism would have to say there are no objects at all. Because they say the only objects are the ones that don't comprise anything else, don't compose anything else. But according to Gunk, there are no objects that don't compose anything else. So nihilism would then have to say nothing exists, which seems to be a problem. So in response, they would have to say, no, there's no such thing as Gunk. Conceptually, there has to be a point at which we reach the simplest stage. Aristotle believed this, Democritus believed this. Okay, well then that leads to the discussion of simples. What are they? And it turns out, just as there are problems defining material objects, I skipped over that, but material objects, there's a problem in defining what makes a material object. Is it something that has a location, is extended in space? Or is it something that's just located in space? Or is it something that has a certain set of properties, as Peter van Inwagen says? All of these have their problems. A similar challenge is faced when we're talking about simples. You could say a simple is, the simplest thing is something that has no extension. It's a single point. It's not 3D anymore. But the trouble with that view, that's called by the authors of the material objects, Marcosian and the other guy, it's called the pointy view of simples. But the problem with this is, if they literally don't extend, then it seems that you could have two in the same place, co-location, but then they would comprise a third thing, which is then not a simple. Because if two of them are in the same place, that they together compose a third thing, and then that third thing is not a simple because it's composed of two other things. So a point would not be sufficient to establish that you are a simple thing. What if we say physically indivisible? That the simplest building blocks are those that cannot be divided. But, well, what's physically indivisible? Maybe you could have very large things that are literally just impossible to divide. That seems wrong. That seems to go against our idea of atoms, that the simplest things could be bigger than the galaxy. Or what if you have a bomb that you cannot divide it because it would blow up? So to say physically indivisible seems a bit arbitrary. What about metaphysically? That is, we cannot even conceptually divide it. Well, that seems like it reduces to the pointy view, because what's the thing that you can't divide anymore? It's a single point. And they also come up with the example of Poindexter, which is a point size cannot be devised, but Poindexter, in theory, could get bigger. So in theory, Poindexter could be divided if he got bigger first. And therefore, it suggests that there's no metaphysically indivisible things. Again, you can work on that, so I'm skipping past some debate. Fundamental particle, that is, in our complete and final view of physics, whatever it is that is, like at the moment, is it quarks anymore? I'm not sure. But whatever plays the role of quark, it's like right at the bottom in the perfect view of physics, that's it. But we would never know what that was then, because we never know if we've reached it. And you could have different fundamental particles for different universes. Whereas don't we want to say that simples should be the same across possible worlds? Alternatively, there's this view, Max Con. And Max Con says where... let's see, Max Con, it's page 209 in the Carroll and Marcosian. And that is the view of maximally continuous view of symbols. When an object is spatially continuous and when the region it occupies is not part of some larger spatially continuous matter-filled region, then that object is said to be maximally continuous. So something as a mereological simple, mereology, remember, is the philosophical debate, this particular area of metaphysics where you're talking about the relationship of parts to wholes. And Max Con has no parts. It's a mereological simple is something that has no parts other than itself, has no proper parts. But the trouble with that is, if Max Con is larger than the point, then we can imagine it being a little sphere and having the top part be red and the bottom part be blue. And then you could say, wait a minute, isn't Max Con therefore no longer simple because it has two parts? And the response to that is to say, first, to deny that a maximally continuous object can be heterogeneous, that it's impossible for that to happen. Well, that seems then the only way to avoid that is to go back to the pointy view. Or two, to claim that although the sphere has such spatially indexed properties as blue at region 1 and red at region 2, there is nothing in the example that has the property of being plain old blue. So there is no part that is blue. That just seems playing with words. Insist that nothing in the example of property as being plain old blue, but maintain that the sphere has a certain blue plus red color distribution property, or the most reasonable sounding, to say that simple objects can be composed of stuff. So simples are the smallest possible objects, but objects are composed of stuff. Now, then what you're doing is you're drawing an ontological distinction between things, objects, and the stuff that they're made of. So things are made of stuff. This is philosophy. Things are made of stuff. There, you've learned something. But no object, no thing is identical with the stuff it's made of. This sounds a lot like constitution, only instead of talking about one object constituting another, you're talking about stuff constituting objects. That, again, you're adding to the furniture of the world by saying that there's stuff as well as things. But also, once you introduce stuff, maybe the simplest view is just to get rid of things and say that the world is just stuff. And again, that's a way of avoiding all of the problems that these things get into. The just stuff view enables, for example, us to talk about the statue and the lump, that the clay, instead of the statue and the lump as two different objects, talk about the statue as an object and the lump as the stuff that it's made of. And so you can have different stuff comprising objects with no philosophical puzzles. Now, if we get rid of things altogether, just stuff, that again is a very simple view, but that raises the problem of what are you, particularly given that you are made of different stuff all the time. As we saw with spruce and F, you can be made of different stuff at different times. And, you know, it's supposedly true that we shed all of our cells over an 8-year period. So I'm made of a certain set of cells and atoms. And then 8 years from now, I will look similar, more haggard. But I will be made of completely different stuff. But it'll still be me, let's assume. So how can the just stuff theorists say that all that exists as stuff, how can they talk about me? Don't they have to say that I don't really exist because there's just different stuff? There's some stuff clumped together, but as it's different stuff, there's no thing that continues to exist through time. Maybe you could try and say that I am a thing that's composed of different stuff at different times. But that seems to violate the transitivity of identity, because you could say, you know, spruce is composed of F at one moment and G at another one. So spruce equals F and spruce equals G. Spruce equals F at time 1, spruce equals G at time 2, but F does not equal G. How can that be? Because spruce equals F, spruce equals G. So by the transitivity of identity, it has to be that F equals G, but it doesn't. They're different chunks of stuff. So this creates a problem of humans, which is maybe why Van Inwagen is drawn to Organicism as a suggestion that there's a life that helps out. Which also brings up the issue of identity over time. What are the conditions of identity over time in general for objects? Even for whatever we're talking about, whether or not we believe in stuff or whether or not we believe in things or that some combination. What is it that makes my car the same from one year to the next? There's spatio-temporal continuity, but the trouble with that is it seems like we think if quantum mechanics is right, it's possible to make a leap, a non-continuous leap. So a particle could be here and then here without being any of the places in between. And yet we want to say it's the same particle. So that seems it violates that. And you can even do that with a bicycle. So you can have a bicycle here, take it into its parts, so that it's no longer a bicycle, it's just a bucket of parts. Take the bucket over here, reassemble the bicycle. The bicycle existed here, the bicycle existed here. It didn't exist anywhere in between. But it's the same bicycle, so it seems like spatio-temporal continuity is not necessary. We also want to say sameness of substantival kind. That is, My car couldn't become a robot and be the same thing. Sorry, Transformers. But what about a caterpillar and a butterfly? Is it the same? It's the same creature. The caterpillar is just the early stage of the butterfly, so it's the same creature, but they seem to be different kinds of things. So even though these seem to be the most obvious criteria for a physical object to continue to exist through time, there's problems with both of them. And even if you get both of them together, so it seems like neither of them are necessary, and it seems like even if you have both of them together, it's not sufficient. The example of the rock, where's that? That's on page 2, around 214. Imagine, suppose that you have a favorite rock sitting on your desk, and that at midnight tonight, a very powerful being, for no particular reason, annihilates that rock, so that it literally disappears into thin air. But suppose that also a second very powerful being, who has no knowledge of either the first being or your rock, decides purely on a whim to create a brand new rock out of thin air. And suppose that, as luck would have it, and this would admittedly be a rather large coincidence, the second creature's rock comes into existence at just the moment that your original rock goes out of existence, in exactly the location vacated by your rock, and with all of the same intrinsic properties. You can see what this is getting at. The new rock would be spatiotemporally continuous with the original rock, of exactly the same kind, but we still want to say two different rocks. So these conditions are neither necessary nor jointly sufficient for sameness of identity over time, which shows that there's a puzzle about that. All right. This is a huge area. You wouldn't have thought talking about things and stuff could take up so much time and mental energy, but never underestimate philosophers at complicating simple shit, because that's what we do. And it turns out that maybe simple shit is not so simple after all.